Hello, I'm Alicia Barry. Welcome to the Business Summer Series as we take a look at some of the biggest stories that grabbed headlines in the past year. Coming up on the program, from high flyers to the high seas, the cruise industry hoping for calmer waters as international ships set sail again.
People are almost revenge booking. They're booking, quite soon to travel.
And pandemic boom stocks going bust. The shine comes off buy now, pay later companies facing tighter rules and the end of cheap money.
Some of these businesses will disappear and we'll never see them again. That's a fact. In this environment, there'll be no more funding for them.
Also on the program, playing the long game. The big miners doubling down on iron ore production just as demand from China stalls.
We've spent $1 billion on it, a decade of making sure we get all the technology settings right, and now we're simply excited to see it happen.
Inflation was one of the biggest buzzwords of 2022. Prices were rising at the fastest rate since the 1990s. Central banks across the globe were faced with the complicated task of raising interest rates to stamp out inflation without slamming the brakes on economies plagued by soaring fuel prices and supply chain bottlenecks. The surging cost of living was on everyone's mind. Gareth Hutchins filed this report in March.
The cost of living is rising. Every motorist knows it when filling up, and every shopper knows their basket is getting more expensive. And what the Reserve Bank does next could add to those costs.
Australian households will certainly feel the adverse consequences of higher petrol prices and higher food prices, as their counterparts in other advanced economies will do, and there's not a lot that they can do in the short term to mitigate the impact of those price movements on their standards of living.
For 2 years, the economy has been buffeted by a series of crises. Pandemic-weary consumers are now facing the impact of catastrophic floods, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine is roiling global markets.
Some of what's happening in international markets is likely to be temporary, and that's the big question for the Reserve Bank, is how much of this is going to last and how much of this is going to pass through quite quickly.
Shoppers are dealing with prices rising much faster than the Reserve Bank predicted. Now the RBA is caught between a rock and a hard place. When to raise interest rates and by how much?
Last thing you want is rates to be raised too quickly, put too much downward pressure on the economy.
One of the biggest economic pains is in the hip pocket nerve. Oil may have come back to $100 a barrel this week, but energy prices have been on a wild ride recently, with the biggest supply shock since the Yom Kippur War in 1973.
3 out of 4 stations were closed. 99 out of 100 will be closed tomorrow.
What central banks don't want to see is a repeat of images like these. The oil shocks of the 1970s ricocheted around the world, and it took 15 years to build a new economic order and get inflation back under control. But economists here say no matter how bad it looks now, it's not a repeat of that chaotic decade.
The likelihood that Australian businesses or Australian workers are going to find themselves in an inflationary spiral in the way that we did in the 70s and 80s is, I think, fairly low.
It's very easy to get very jumpy, but we do need to take a deep breath and look calmly at how persistent, how deep flowing are these inflationary impacts.
And those impacts are very different for Australia than those facing Europe and the United States.
Australia's in a different position though, because we export many of the commodities whose prices are rising. This means that our terms of trade will rise over the months ahead, which will provide a boost to our national income.
The RBA Governor will be keenly watching the US Federal Reserve, which is expected to deliver a small interest rate increase tomorrow. But it will be economic events that will determine if and when the RBA pulls the trigger.
More on the Reserve Bank's response later in the program. Travel was an industry stopped cold by the pandemic, costing the economy billions of dollars. After 2 long years, borders reopened and international cruise ships were given the go-ahead to return to Australia. By April, there was no shortage of people packing their bags, as Sue Lannon reports.
And Amber Jade Smith has been dancing since she was just 4 years old. Now she's won her first contract to work on a cruise ship.
This contract to me means the world. I never thought anything like this would happen to me. It's honestly a lifetime opportunity that I'm so lucky to have achieved.
The 18-year-old will set sail later this year.
Because I'm fully vaxxed, I feel like that takes away a lot of the nerves moving on to cruises with COVID happening.
Australia's cruise industry will reopen on April 17th, after being banned for more than 2 years. Since then, the industry has lost $10 billion, putting more than 18,000 direct and indirect jobs at risk. Before the pandemic, spending by cruise ship passengers was worth $1.4 billion a year.
And that's the travel agents, the tour operators, the food and beverage suppliers, the hotel and accommodation sector, transport providers.
Belle Goldie had to close her travel agency and take a job in retail when the pandemic hit.
I had a commercial property with staff a couple of days a week. I overnight realised that this was serious, a serious financial thing for me as well, because I'd put all of my family's money into my new business.
She has just reopened her travel agency in Western Sydney.
People are almost revenge booking. They are booking for last minute, kind of May, June, July. They're booking, quite soon to travel, whereas cruising typically in the past has been up to an 18-month lead-in time. People are booking multiple cruises now.
Jodie Paulin has booked her holiday on the high seas for May. She spent $20,000 on cruises for her family.
It's just going to be the biggest celebration, isn't it? I can't wait to get back on board.
She's set to board the Pacific Explorer, which will become the first international cruise ship to sail into Sydney Harbour when the ban is lifted.
So this here is our 24-carat gold ship on a stick.
Miss Paulin says the virus will not stop her getting on board.
I'm no more worried about getting COVID on a cruise than I am going down to my local shopping centre.
In March 2020, an outbreak on the Ruby Princess left nearly 30 people dead and infected more than 600 others. The industry says new COVID safety measures will keep passengers safe.
The whole journey from the moment the passenger makes the booking, the communications, pre-cruising testing, vaccination in order to get on board, and then of course all the public health measures that you'd expect to find when you're on the ship.
More than 80% of the world's cruise ship fleet is already in operation and more than 7 million people have already sailed. But the industry faces challenges like more COVID outbreaks and high costs.
You can get it anywhere, sure, but it's a concentrated group of people. It's hard to do the tyranny of social distance, if you like, so it's going to spread pretty quickly.
Despite the challenges, Amber Jade Smith says the return of cruises is good for the arts industry.
Honestly, we've been waiting for this for ages, especially young dancers like me. We've been holding back from things like this because we haven't had the opportunity to.
She's hoping the show can go on.
Sue Lannon there. Speaking of shows, in-home entertainment like Netflix enjoyed a massive uptake during lockdowns. But as people got out and about again, there was an exodus of subscribers, sending the Netflix share price plummeting. The streaming provider also cracked down on users sharing passwords in the hope of increasing its members. Nassim Karem this time.
For 8 years, Cliff Karp has been watching his favourite shows on Netflix.
During the pandemic, I was watching it more than I am watching it now. So I would say I was probably watching it about 3-4 times a week. Post-pandemic, maybe once a week.
Cliff has a monthly subscription, but it covers 2 households.
I share my password with my parents.
After suffering its first subscriber losses in more than a decade, the streaming giant is looking to crack down on password sharing by its 6 million local users. It's already trialling this in Chile, Costa Rica and Peru.
We're working on how to monetize sharing. We've been thinking about that for a couple of years. Remember, these are over 100 million households that already are choosing to view Netflix. They love the service. We just got to get paid, in some degree for them.
Netflix saw about $54 billion wiped off its stock market value after the company said it lost 200,000 subscribers globally in its first quarter. The result fell well short of its forecast of adding 2.5 million subscribers. Users are ditching the streaming service now that lockdown restrictions have been lifted, and new players are moving into the market.
There's so much competition from other platforms at the moment, whether it be Stan, Prime, Apple TV or Disney+.
Netflix is considering bringing in advertising for some subscriptions, but its biggest hope is that non-paying customers will turn into paid subscribers after its password sharing crackdown.
I'm happy with what Netflix have offered me now, so I see myself sticking with them in the long term.
Netflix can only hope for that kind of loyalty in an increasingly competitive market.
Competition and supply chain issues were adding to inflation. By May, it was obvious that Australia's Reserve Bank had to act, which meant raising interest rates. The central bank was about to embark on its steepest rate hiking cycle in 3 decades, putting 1 million new borrowers to the test, as Amelia Terzon explains.
Jason Andrew is one of many homeowners who are now facing rising mortgage repayments.
It does certainly create some uncertainty and potentially some anxiety for us. We're probably the first generation that hasn't seen real interest rates increase.
Jason and his partner are on a variable mortgage, and a rate hike comes as they prepare for parenthood.
We're into that new phase of life where we have additional costs as well, so it's interest rate rises combined with childcare fees, school fees.
The Reserve Bank hasn't raised the cash rate in more than a decade. It's been at a record low of almost 0% during the pandemic, and now it's going up to 0.35%.
It's not unreasonable to expect that the interest rates would get back to 2.5%.
The RBA governor says the board had to act to try to get inflation under control, which he says will stay for a while.
Our central forecast, which is that underlying inflation will decline to the top of the target band in 2024.
Prices are surging on everything from food to fuel through to building new homes. Economists say with inflation above 5%, the board made the right call.
What this does is it slows down the spiral effect where lots of people buy stuff at the same time and then that stuff gets much more expensive over time.
Adelaide Timbrell expects the RBA to hike rates consecutively in the coming months.
So we think that by the end of this year, the cash rate will go from its current 0.35 to 1.25. And then by May next year, we'll see it go up even more to 2.25%.
The initial hit to borrowers will vary. It will all depend on whether your bank passes on the full rate hike to you. The rate rise will add $78 a month to an average mortgage on a variable rate. This will soar to $615 a month this time next year if the cash rate hits 2%. Those with bigger variable loans will be hit even harder, including Bashir Naim, who's building a new home for his family.
With the last few years, all you hear about is rates dropping and the government encouraging people to buy and the housing market booming, and now it's sort of the opposite. From our point of view, with the cost of building being very high, it hasn't come at a good time, I suppose.
Many Australians, like first home buyer Kelly Lehman, fixed their home loans during the pandemic.
With the market the way it is, it was just sort of inevitable, and I was trying to scrounge as quickly as possible to refinance.
Her repayments will stay low for now, but she faces a much higher rate when her deal ends.
I can definitely see that being an issue coming, the end of my 2-year stint of being locked in.
Not everybody's unhappy about the Reserve Bank's decision. Savers have been waiting a long time for this moment.
Oh, I want them to go up over 20%, like they did 3 times in the 1980s.
With deposit rates so low, Grant Agnew's nest egg has been doing little in the bank.
There has been cash coming in, but a minimal amount. It's been very difficult.
For the next generation, the purse strings are also tightening.
Since May, the Reserve Bank has delivered 7 further consecutive hikes, taking the cash rate to a decade high of 3.1%. At least $275 billion worth of fixed-rate loans with the Big Four banks will come to an end between July and December in 2023. While homeowners with variable mortgages have been facing regular increases as the cash rate goes up, fixed-rate borrowers are now facing a steep, almost immediate jump in their repayments. Wary borrowers now have a short holiday reprieve until the bank meets again in February. But the RBA is warning it will do whatever it takes to slay the inflation dragon. When the pandemic hit, rapid changes were made to insolvency laws to prevent thousands of companies going under. The tax office stopped pursuing debt, but 2 years on, it was owed $60 billion and eager to collect. Experts predicted a number of companies would be wound up, particularly in the troubled construction sector, as Daniel Ziffer reports.
Construction companies are absorbing soaring costs for materials and staff and can't ask their customers to pay more.
You have no margin for error, really, before your profit is wiped out.
When the pandemic began in 2020, insolvency laws were changed and the tax office stopped chasing debt. As the economy returns to a new normal, the ATO wants the $40 billion it's owed.
We will start to see some movement in insolvency, and I think that's going to be upwards.
On average, more than 9,000 companies enter administration each year. But in the 2.25 years since the pandemic began, just 10,530 businesses have folded. That's fewer than have previously gone under in single years.
A lot of these businesses will look like they're operating normally, they'll be paying their wages, they'll be keeping the lights on, but their balance sheets and their financial position might be very stressed.
One of the key triggers to enter insolvency is tax debt that can't be paid. Previously secret documents, obtained by the ABC, show the ATO paused its firmer and stronger actions. And media and community sentiment played a part in the ATO supporting small business by not chasing debts. Now that's changed.
The ATO sent about 500,000 letters out to businesses over the last 6 or 8 weeks, telling them that it's back to business as normal. They've got to get back into their tax payment regime.
Turning up the heat on a construction sector already troubled by the collapses of big-name firms.
Australian construction giant ProBuild has entered administration with billions of dollars of projects across the country now at a standstill.
That hits sole traders and subcontractors, many of whom are already dipping into their personal finances to keep going.
They're twice as likely to have their personal mortgages in arrears as the general population, so clearly there's some pressure.
Providing a safe harbour and ignoring growing tax debts helped companies through the early period of the pandemic. Now that the ATO has resumed business as normal, thousands of businesses will fold, essentially by filing the paperwork. But some have used the system's generosity, are in a deep hole and still taking people's money.
The real issue is that your ordinary consumer doesn't always know or can't always tell. So it's really important for customers to do their due diligence as much as possible around those organisations before they enter into contracts with them.
The tax office has 40 billion reasons to keep collecting, and we all share the need for it too.
For the good of the nation, we need to be able to collect our taxes, to be able to fund important economic initiatives, fund our hospitals, fund our aged care.
After an insolvency drought, no one wants a flood, rather a manageable trickle.
Soaring commodity prices bolstered Australia's exports during the COVID recovery. But slowing demand from China saw the iron ore price dwindle to below half its record high. That didn't stop the big miners opening new sites in Western Australia and ramping up supply, as Rachel Papazzoni found out during a visit to the Pilbara.
This is Australia's newest iron ore mine. It's one of 3 new sites opened by our biggest producers in the last 18 months. BHP, Rio Tinto and FMG hope to extract another 145 million tonnes of iron ore a year. For FMG, this project has been a long time coming.
Iron Bridge was one of our first projects we looked at back in 2003. We've spent $1 billion on it, a decade of making sure we get all the technology settings right.
It's due to export its first load by March. Last year, FMG shipped 189 million tonnes of iron ore. Once Iron Bridge is fully online, it'll add another 22 million a year. Rio Tinto's newest mine, Gudai-Darri, shipped its first ore a few months ago.
We'll provide around about 43 million tonnes of capacity as we continue to ramp that up.
The biggest of the 3 new mines, BHP's South Flank, has been operating for about 18 months.
We've still got a little more than a year to go, I think, before we start to consistently get to that 80 million tonne per annum rate.
Some of the new output from the big 3 is to replace older sites, but ultimately more will be mined, and the timing to increase supply couldn't be worse.
The iron ore price has been particularly weak in recent weeks.
China imports about 3/4 of the world's iron ore, but ongoing COVID lockdowns and developer defaults have sent its property market into a tailspin.
And that's been traditionally, for the last decade or two, it's been probably 1/3 or more of China's steel demand, and therefore over 1/6 of global steel demand.
Higher interest rates globally are also dampening demand. The value of Australian exports are down about $40 billion from the peak, with the price at about 1/3 of its roughly $240 high last year, now about $85 a tonne. As China's demand keeps slowing, there'll be less need for iron ore from the Pilbara, and that's likely to see the price keep falling. The Treasurer isn't relying on higher prices to boost the budget.
And we've taken a really responsible approach to that and banked almost all of the revenue surge over the next couple of years.
Andrew Forrest says good business sense will see operators ride the price downturn.
All you do is keep your costs way, way below anything the iron ore industry could ever afford, and then you're okay.
But for those with tight margins, it will start to hurt.
The key for the market now will be to come to grips with where cost support kicks in and start to pressure iron ore miners to stop mining because they're losing cash.
Rio's not giving off any concerns about a cost crunch.
We are seeing some short-term weakness, but the long-term future for the iron ore business is strong. The world continues to need steel and will continue to need steel for the lives people want to live, as well as future decarbonisation.
And BHP has further expansion in its sites.
We're currently studying growing the business to 330 million tonnes per annum. We're feeling pretty confident the market will be supportive of a production level in that type of range.
UBS thinks the price isn't far from its bottom, which would be welcome news for the miners.
Rachel Papazzoni there. Along with crypto and cashless transactions, buy now, pay later products hit the mainstream during COVID-19. But soon, the golden era for the much hyped sector appeared over, as rising interest rates, bad debts and looming regulation took centre stage. Rihanna Whitson with this story.
As customers look for ways to make cuts to their household budgets,
for everything's so expensive, you know.
Some are switching to buying essentials with buy now, pay later products.
People can buy like a bulk pack and not actually, shell out their money for it. They can put on a payment plan.
At Zip, we love putting you in control of your money.
Buy now, pay later companies buy a customer's debt in exchange for a merchant fee. Customers make interest-free repayments in instalments, but if they pay late, they get charged. It's now a crowded market with big players muscling in.
Just look for Apple Pay at checkout.
You've seen a land grab where these businesses are spending a lot of money on sales and marketing to acquire new customers. Those customers aren't necessarily good customers.
Afterpay's proportion of debts that customers can't afford to pay back has risen to nearly 14% of outstanding loans. Zipco, Klarna and Affirm are all under 10%, but they're still much higher than arrears on Commonwealth Bank's credit cards.
Some of these businesses will disappear and we'll never see them again. That's a fact. In this environment, there'll be no more funding for them.
These stocks have tumbled. Afterpay's lost 50% since its merger with Block in January, and in a year, Hum, Zipco and Sezzle have all plummeted.
As interest rates rise in response to rising inflation, then of course what happens is your cost goes up. So the margin that you make on your book of loans declines.
In the face of a declining share price, Zipco plans to merge with competitor Sezzle.
Reports of our demise are greatly exaggerated. In March, we did take proactive steps to reduce our global cost footprint, and we'll see the benefits of those in the FY23.
Regulation is also looming for buy now, pay later products. The sector's currently exempt from credit laws because it technically doesn't charge interest on repayments. Instead, some companies have signed up to a voluntary code, but that's about to change.
We'll consult with industry and with consumer groups. We'll look to legislating, whether we do that in one step or two. We will ensure that buy now, pay later is regulated as a form of credit.
They don't need the same sort of regulation as might govern a mortgage. And of course, we've seen that regulation of the banking sector does not necessarily deliver better outcomes.
Consumer advocates disagree.
There are so many people who are coming to us who have gotten in over their heads, and they've often gotten in very, very quickly. So whatever checks they are doing, it is not the same as doing a proper responsible lending check as is required under the credit law.
In terms of next week, so Doug's got...
The boss of smaller player, FoodPay, says regulation needs to be tougher than adopting the industry's voluntary code.
You've got to be regulated, but not have open-ended credit, staying away from that debt trap, or we think the bad credit model of credit cards.
Carving out new laws to benefit retailers and consumers.
And that's all from this episode of the Business Summer Series. For more business stories, head to the ABC News website or catch up at any time on iView. The Business will return on air weeknights from January 30. I'm Alicia Barry. Thanks for watching.